This episode of the History Guy is brought to you by Incogni. Take your personal data off the market.
In the last several years, the U.S. Postal Service has dramatically reduced the amount of air moved by mail by more than 90%. But before that changed, the Post Service moved as many as 6 million pounds of airmail per day. In fact, airmail was an important part of the early development of American aviation, but it might not have developed quite the way that it did were it not for 78 days in the winter of 1933 and 1934, when a scandal erupted that changed the face of U.S. air service for good. Its history that deserves to be remembered. Looking at my monthly report, I sometimes just take for granted that Incogni is looking out for me and my privacy. And thank you, Incogni, for sponsoring this episode of The History Guy. Go to incogni.com/thehistoryguy and use the code TheHistoryGuy to get 60% off.
Thousands of companies are collecting, aggregating, and trading your personal data without you knowing anything about it. Keeping and selling things like your full name, email, home address, gender, phone number, education, relatives, social security number, employment history, shopping habits, stuff that can lead to unwanted spam or even identity theft. You have the right to request that data brokers delete what information they have about you and protect your privacy, but the bad news is it would take you years to do it manually, and even if you did, new data pirates are continually coming along. Incogni can do the messy work for you automatically. Incogni helps you protect your privacy and take your personal data off the market by reaching out to data brokers on your behalf, requesting your personal data removal, and dealing with their objections. And the best part is Incogni continues to address those threats as they arise. Look, this is my convenient monthly report. Incogni sent another 43 new removal requests in May alone. And this is amazing. Since I signed on with Incogni in September of 2023, they have saved me more than 437 hours of work that would have taken for me to try to do the more than 660 removal requests. And even better, Incogni has new unlimited and family unlimited plans and an extra level of protection with a custom removals feature. You can point to any people search site or any other website where your personal information is visible, and one of their privacy agents will take care of the rest for you.
So use the code TheHistoryGuy at incogni.com/thehistoryguy to get 60% off. That's the code TheHistoryGuy at incogni.com/thehistoryguy for your exclusive offer of 60% off.
The United States Post Office Department began experimenting with moving mail by air in September 1911, when Earl Ovington was sworn in by U.S. Postmaster General Frank Hitchcock to fly 640 letters and 1,280 postcards from an airfield in Garden City, New York, less than 6 miles to the post office in Mineola, New York. The first scheduled mail service began on May 15, 1918, using 6 U.S. Army Air Service Curtiss Jennies converted for mail. The planes were flown by military pilots and began a regular route between Washington, D.C. and New York City. The flights were taken over by the Postal Department on August 12, 1918, using JR-1B planes that had been purpose-built for the job. By December, scheduled service between New York and Chicago began. Transcontinental service between New York and San Francisco began September 8, 1920. All of these flights were made entirely by the U.S. government, using planes owned and operated by the government. This changed beginning in 1926 after Congress passed the Kelly Act, which required the government to contract airmail to private industry. Contracts were awarded based on competitive bids, and by September 1927, all U.S. airmail routes were flown under contract by commercial contractors. By 1929, 45 airlines were involved in mail delivery. Among the major contractors was Boeing. There were issues, however. Subsidies for carrying mail exceeded the cost of the mail itself, and some carriers abused contracts by producing junk mail to carry or hauling heavy freight as mail, since they were paid by weight. The mail was so valuable that it discouraged flying passengers. Historian Oliver Allen, in his book The Airline Builders, estimated that airlines would have needed to charge a 150-pound person $450 per ticket, more than $8,000 adjusted for inflation, to match the payment for carrying 150 pounds of mail. In 1926, Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover named William P. McCracken, Jr. the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Aeronautics, making him the first federal regulator for commercial aviation. McCracken left the department in 1929, but remained involved with the airline industry in his law practice. In 1930, Hoover, now president, appointed Walter Folger Brown Postmaster General. Brown, in an attempt to improve the efficiency of airmail, sought legislation that would allow him to change postal policy. The stock market crash and ensuing depression threatened to put many of the airlines out of business, allowing Brown to argue for the passage of the McNary-Waters Act, which authorized Brown to negotiate new contracts, longer term and with rates based on space or volume of the planes instead of by weight of mail. Basing the rates on space or volume was meant to disincentivize airlines filling their planes with junk mail, but also incentivized flying planes empty, as the airline was paid the same amount regardless of what they carried. It was hoped that it would encourage the airlines to carry more passengers in the space not used for the mail. Contracts were supposed to be awarded to the lowest responsible bidder, with airlines that had been flying routes of at least 250 miles daily for 6 months. The act also allowed carriers with existing contracts to exchange those contracts for a route certificate, which would give them a contract to run those routes for an additional 10 years. Finally, it gave Brown the right to extend or consolidate routes at his discretion. At about the same time, the United Aircraft and Transport Company, a large company put together by William Boeing of Boeing and Frederick Rensher of Pratt & Whitney, acquired the controlling interest in National Air Transport, creating the first transcontinental airline. Brown was actually concerned about the purchase, which he feared would bring the specter of monopoly over negotiations for the bill. Brown reached out to McCracken to work out a deal between carriers and the post office to consolidate airmail routes and pick the best companies to run them. 3 weeks after the passage of the McNary-Waters bill, a series of meetings began that would later be dubbed the Spoils Conference. Brown brought together the nation's largest airlines, and according to Colonel Louis Britton of Northwest Airways, advised them that if they could agree among themselves on an equitable apportionment of routes, he would grant the airmail contracts to extend those airmail contracts of lines already carrying airmail. The conferences were not secret, but the implications seemed to pass everyone by. Of the 27 airmail operation contracts, Brown awarded nearly all to only 3 major airlines, which would force a large number of smaller, supposedly inefficient companies to merge with the larger ones. He consolidated the various routes to 3 transcontinental routes. United already held contracts on the northern route. Brown wanted to award the central route to Transcontinental Air and Transport, but they lacked the night flying experience required by the 1930 Act. So Brown helped force a merger between TAT and Western Air Express, creating Transcontinental and Western Air, or TWA. The last of the 3 companies was American Airways, which was formed from the union of more than 30 smaller airlines, which was given the southern route. The system seemed to be effective. By 1932, the airline industry was one of the only sectors of the economy with steady growth. The numbers of passengers carried and employees hired was growing, and even airmail, charged at a higher rate and thus often considered frivolous during the Depression years, had doubled after the restructuring. The cost of airmail dropped from $1.10 to 54 cents a mile, but trouble was brewing. It began with a friendly dinner between an officer of the Ludington Airline and Fulton Lewis, Jr., a reporter for William Randolph Hearst. Ludington was a small airline that was the first in American history to make a profit only carrying passengers when it opened in 1930. But cheap airline travel was a novelty in the Depression, and soon Ludington was desperate for money. The Ludington officer told Lewis that they had tried to get a contract for a proposed express service for mail to Newark, New Jersey, but that the company couldn't get the contract even after offering the extremely low bid of 25 cents a mile. Lewis didn't seem to think much of the conversation until he saw that the Post Office Department had awarded that route to Ludington's rival, Eastern Air Transport, at a bid of 89 cents a mile. By February of 1933, Ludington sold to the rival for a bottom basement price of $260,000. Time magazine would later report that Brown himself had pressured the sale and even threatened to give the contract to Ludington unless Eastern would absorb Ludington. Lewis sought to find someone in the government interested in investigating, but struggled to find anyone who would bite, until he approached Senator Hugo Lafayette Black. The 1932 election saw Hoover and his Republican Party lose nearly everywhere. Democrats picked up 10 Senate seats and a net of 97 House seats. Many smaller airlines complained about the new system and hoped the new government would listen. On February 25, 1933, a week before Roosevelt's inauguration, the Senate approved Black's resolution to form a special committee to investigate the government's awarding of mail contracts. The main criticism of Brown's spoils conferences was that Brown had awarded the routes without a formal bidding process to find the lowest bidders. But Brown argued that he had acted in the public's interest by inviting only the most experienced companies. Additionally, both Brown and McCracken owned shares in some of the companies that benefited from the outcome. When called to testify, McCracken refused to cooperate fully. He refused to hand over papers and information he claimed was protected by attorney-client privilege. Black appealed to the Senate, which gave him permission to subpoena the information. McCracken still refused and allowed some of the documents to be destroyed. The Senate authorized the Sergeant-at-Arms to arrest McCracken and 3 others. Black had to rely on clever investigation. Two postal employees painstakingly reconstructed documents that had been thrown in the trash. Eventually, the Senate held McCracken and another in contempt for destroying subpoenaed materials. Ultimately, the committee found that while the awarding of contracts was corrupt, many sides bore blame for it, including Congress for drafting ill-advised laws granting too much power. The report said that officials like Brown flagrantly betrayed their trust and maladministered those laws, accusing airlines and others publicly of posing as patriots, of taking advantage for private profit. While it also proved that Brown had improved efficiencies and cost, it still recommended a new program based on competitive bidding to save millions of dollars in the future. The report would lead to multiple laws and changes in both airmail and merchant marine policy. President Roosevelt decided to cancel the contracts, but airmail service needed to continue. At a February 9th cabinet meeting, Secretary of War George Dern, without consulting either Army Chief of Staff Douglas MacArthur or Chief of the Air Corps Major General Benjamin Falloy, said that the Army Air Corps could take the job if ordered. Falloy was called into a meeting with Harley Branch, the second Assistant Postmaster General, the same day. There he was asked how long it would take for the Army Air Corps to be ready to carry the mail. Some reports claim that he said it would take 4 to 6 weeks, but in his autobiography he said he told Branch that they could be ready in about a week or 10 days. He admitted that he answered casually and said that he had misunderstood that Branch meant from this moment on. MacArthur learned about it via a reporter before Falloy could talk to him. The White House had announced at 4 p.m. that Roosevelt had signed an executive order annulling all domestic airmail contracts as of February 19th. The Air Corps had 10 days. There were 25,000 miles of airway in the 26 routes. The planes the private companies flew were modern passenger planes with the latest technology. They flew mostly at night. The Air Corps would fly a reduced version, only 17 routes and 11,000 miles. The Corps, however, was not as prepared for the challenge as they had implied. Air Corps pilots were trained mostly to fly in daytime and good weather. Nearly all of their planes were open cockpit. Although Falloy would tell a House committee that we have assigned to this work the most experienced pilots in the Army Air Service, including pilots with a great deal of experience in flying at night and in flying in fogs and bad weather, of the 250 pilots assigned to the Army Air Corps mail operation, nearly all of them were lieutenants with less than 2 years flying experience. Only 31 of the pilots had more than 50 hours of nighttime flying. In his autobiography, Falloy seemed to recall things differently. Very few of our pilots had extensive instrument and night flying experience. We did not have the latest instruments, and not very many of our planes had landing, navigation, or cockpit lights. The techniques of flying the newly developed radio beams were developed by the airline pilots, and our pilots were not very adept at using them. 2 days later, 3 airmail pilots were killed in 2 separate training flights. The Corps used 14 different types of aircraft to fly the mail, mostly open cockpit biplanes. Within the first week, the P-12 pursuit fighters were withdrawn. They could only carry 50 pounds of mail, which made the plane tail-heavy and dangerous to fly at night in bad weather. They replaced them with O-38 observation planes borrowed from the National Guard. They could carry 160 pounds of mail. The B-6 Keystone bomber could carry 1,100 pounds, but flew slowly and offered little protection in bad weather for pilots. The best planes for the job were the A-12 attack aircraft and the YB-10 bombers. The A-12 was open cockpit but could carry 400 pounds of mail, while the YB-10 was a twin-engine monoplane with a closed cockpit that could carry 2,000 pounds of mail. Both were new and the Army had very few available. Falloy ordered a hasty program to put directional gyros, artificial horizons, and a radio in each plane, but the Army mechanics had no experience with them, and they were poorly installed, often useless or installed where a pilot couldn't use them. On top of that, weather would be a persistent issue. The first flights were scheduled to fly February 19th from New Jersey, but a blizzard grounded them. Instead, the first took off the same day from Kansas City, Missouri, bound for St. Louis. Demand was higher than expected as stamp collectors tried to get letters into the historic first runs. On February 22nd, 2 airmail pilots crashed, killing the pilots. The next day, an OA-4A plane ferrying pilots went down off the coast of New York, drowning a passenger. And it didn't help. Another blizzard quickly followed the first, cementing the season as one of the worst in decades. The bad weather showed no sign of letting up, and neither did our casualties, Lieutenant Colonel Hap Arnold said. 10 days after the Army started carrying the mail, the whole country was angry. One pilot described to the New York Times, "Picture an Army aviator flying at night in sub-zero weather, in the open, with a biting wind lashing him at 100 miles an hour." Falloy tried to shift course. On February 24th, he ordered that pilots with less than 2 years' experience would only fly at night in good weather. The operation was a disaster behind the scenes, too. The Air Corps had no money. A transfer from the Post Office Department was blocked by the Attorney General. The Air Corps got $300,000 in emergency reserve funds from the Army, but it wasn't enough. Pilots didn't receive their $5 per diem and often slept in the hangars with their planes. A bill to fund the operation passed the House on February 24th, but languished in the Senate as political fallout mounted. There were dozens of crashes. On March 9th, 4 airmail crew members, 3 pilots and 1 mechanic, were killed in crashes in Ohio, Florida, and Wyoming. Eddie Rickenbacker, famous as America's ace of aces in World War I, savaged the whole debacle, telling the press that the deaths were legalized murder and promising there would be more. Charles Lindbergh said that using the Army to carry the mail was unwarranted and contrary to American principles. But both of these heroes, of course, were also associated with the companies that had lost their contracts. Rickenbacker was vice president of Eastern Airlines, while Lindbergh was a paid consultant to 2 airlines. Representative Edith Rogers of Massachusetts joined the outcry, saying, "The story of the airmail will be written in blood on the record of the Roosevelt administration." Despite the headline-grabbing crashes, the Air Corps was actually delivering most of the mail, despite having airplanes unsuited for the job, poor training, and historically bad weather. None of it would be enough to cool the fires of public outrage. On March 10th, FDR called in MacArthur and Falloy to a meeting. For the next 10 minutes, Falloy recalled, "MacArthur and I received a tongue-lashing which I put down in my book as the worst I have ever received in all my military service." Blame from the post office and in Congress focused on Falloy, and Roosevelt told Secretary of War Dern that the Air Corps should only carry mail on routes and in conditions that could ensure as far as the utmost human care could provide against a recurrence of fatal accidents. Falloy suspended all airmail operations for 10 days for aircraft and instruments to be checked. Pilots with less than 2 years of experience were removed from duty. When service resumed on March 19th, it was further reduced to only 8 routes. 2 more fatal accidents occurred in March, but the operation stabilized. It was clear, however, that the Air Corps would have to be relieved and that the airlines would be trusted with the mail. In April, the contracts were open to competitive bidding. While the airlines that had had their contracts canceled were not allowed to participate, they got around the rule by changing their names. American Airways became American Airlines. Eastern Air Transport became Eastern Airlines. TWA added Inc. to their name. When the contracts were awarded on May 3rd, most of the contracts were granted to the same companies that had them before. Some new companies did get contracts, like Braniff and Delta. By June 1st, the Air Corps had flown its last letter. Congress passed the Airmail Act of 1934 later that month. It officially returned the transportation of mail to private airlines, emphasized competitive bidding, and separated airlines from aircraft manufacturers, which broke up Boeing's United Aircraft into 3 companies: the Boeing Airplane Company, the United Aircraft Corporation, and United Airlines. It also banned all former airline executives alleged to have colluded from further contracts or working with airlines that got one.
The Air Corps only carried the mail for 78 days, but in that time they had 66 major accidents and 12 crew deaths. Still, the largest impact was probably on the airlines, as the 1934 Act made the carrying of airmail unprofitable, pushed them towards a model where they carried passengers instead, setting the stage for the modern airline industry that we have today. Some of the airlines did sue the government over the revenue that was lost while the Air Corps covered the airmail, but those suits were settled. It also had a significant impact on the Air Corps, including the activation of the General Headquarters Air Force, which was a small step towards the creation of an independent Air Force. While the reputation of the Air Corps did suffer in the short run, in the long run it helped them address long important issues like instrument training and radio communication and navigational aids, and it convinced them that open cockpit aircraft had become obsolete, leading to the development and adoption of more modern aircraft. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.